Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second Seniors Mental Health Supports webinar. I am Susan Taylor, the Deputy Minister of Seniors and Housing, and it really is a pleasure to have you join us this morning to be able to take a look at focusing on the future. And I'm told by my staff that we have over 60 registrants with us this morning from a number of different organizations across the province, as well as some individuals who have joined. And really, again, thank you for taking time to participate. I also would like to thank our panelists from the Canadian Mental Health Association, who I know will be introduced shortly by our moderator. It really is my pleasure again to be here and to introduce our minister, the Honorable Josephine Pon, Minister of Seniors and Housing. Very unfortunately, our minister is at an all-day meeting and is unable to be able to join us this morning, but I know if it was her preference, she would be here with us. I will say, and I know our staff have been able to understand the expectations from our minister on looking at the ways in which we can support the mental health and well-being of all Albertans, but particularly seniors, and for those folks who are providing assistance and services through our senior serving organizations. This really has been a priority for our minister for several months, and we're just very, very pleased to be able to be here today and to offer our second series through the four-part webinar. So on that note, I'm just going to do a quick introduction of our minister, and then we do have some video greetings on her behalf. So Minister Pon was elected as the MLA for Calgary-Beddington on April the 16th, 2019, and appointed our Minister of Seniors and Housing on April 30th. Her background and experience have given her personal insight into the current economic situation in the province, especially the challenges being faced by everyday Albertans. Minister Pon has spoken often of the impact of the pandemic on Alberta seniors and also of their great resilience. The minister is committed to supporting seniors to reconnect and re-enter society. The Seniors Mental Health webinar series is one tool, of course, to help seniors re-enter a post-pandemic world. And now my pleasure to be able to turn this to a message from our Minister, Honorable Josephine Pon.
Welcome to the Senior Mental Health webinar series. Many people have experienced increased stress and isolations during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has have an effect on their mental health and wellness. This is particularly true for seniors, caregivers, and staff in seniors organizations. Our community partners have told me about these issues, and I have been listening. That's why I'm pleased to offer this webinar to support seniors, their caregivers, and staff as we begin to recover from the pandemic and reconnect with each other. This four-part series is focused on managing social isolation and getting help, reestablishing social connections, dealing with the grief and loss, and managing burnout and stress. I hope these webinars will help to ease people back into normal life, especially those who have experienced significant changes. We all have a role when it comes to supporting our own, each other's mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Now, I will hand things over to the mental health experts. Take care, be well, and stay safe.
Thank you, Minister Pon. My name is Kessa Shikazi, and I am the Executive Director of the Seniors Strategic Planning Branch in Seniors and Housing, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Building from our last webinar on mental health supports and strategies, today we will focus on the future as we transition to post-pandemic life, reestablishing social connections and building community interactions and overall well-being. How do we overcome challenges in managing social isolation, the fear of going back out into the community, and if necessary, accessing help? This is what we'll talk about today. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Just for your awareness, these sessions are being recorded and will be posted on our website. There will be a question and answer period following our panel presentation. And if you'd like to pose questions to our panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And please note that if you prefer, there is an option to pose your questions anonymously. Any resources mentioned during the webinar will be available on our website. Okay, and on to today's discussion. Today we have a panelist with us that brings a breadth of knowledge and experience on the topic of mental health and establishing social connections. David Grauweiler is the Executive Director with the Alberta Division of the Canadian Mental Health Association. David's a leader and advocate for the promotion of mental health in Alberta and establishing connections between organizations, governments, and agencies. More information about David is available on our webpage, and I will now turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Kessa, and greetings from Winnipeg. I'm in Winnipeg this morning, meeting with colleagues around the specific topic that we're touching on today. And as you know, or you may not know, Manitoba is a few steps behind in removing restrictions, and we're sharing our experience with them over the next day and a half. So today we want to talk and reflect on the very current, very real time activities within our own province of Alberta. And there is now the opportunity to reestablish social connections, which were disrupted during the necessary restrictions over the course of the pandemic. And we know that as restrictions are removed and behaviors that became normalized under the restrictions are no longer necessarily required, that there will be a level of anxiety amongst Albertans overall. And for those who were part of the populations particularly impacted by COVID-19 and impacted by the restrictions in various ways, including seniors who experienced significant challenges through this time. The level of anxiety could be higher amongst them as they re-enter a world that was already perhaps creating some social isolation even before the pandemic. And the opportunity is there for any of us at any stage in our lives to experience well-being and live a more flourishing life rather than languishing in the impacts that we've all experienced. Next slide, please. It's important that we always base our thinking and our approaches in science and within an evidence base. And while this is not the only piece of evidence, it is one that gives us a really strong picture of the impacts of social isolation in our lives. And there is a direct link, and it's scientifically proven, that to the extent that we are isolated and withdrawn from society, that it has a direct impact not only on our mental health, but also on our physical health. In fact, those who live in prolonged social isolation are prone to an earlier death and are very often, for various reasons, unable to access the services and supports that perhaps would have prolonged their lives. And I think it's important when I talk about science or when I talk about an evidence base that we keep in mind that there is a lot of bad information out there. And so we do want to focus in on trusted and reliable sources such as the World Health Organization, Centers for Disease Control, etc., and Alberta Health Services. Thanks, Santina. This chart, which will be circulated in the materials that come after the webinar, shows the fact that there are there's a great need for us to ensure that those that we've been supporting, those we've been involved with, perhaps those we've been checking in on in our own neighborhoods, that there is an effort made now to ask questions and to be in a supportive and approachable way, inquiring around how are people re-engaging, how are they feeling. And of course, we mentioned that there'll be anxiety, and there will be some who will have adopted practices, etc., that kept them safe during the pandemic, but that with the rise in vaccinations many Albertans, I think we're well over 50% now having their second vaccination. Some of those practices will no longer be required. They're certainly not in place as restrictions, but people will have to be, we will have to be patient with ourselves and with others as we find a level of comfort that works for us. And so as we interact across the, in our communities with each other, there will be some who will be wearing masks that might be perplexing to others who have chosen not to. But much as we entered into this experience as needing to express kindness, be patient with each other, etc., I think it's true about the re-entry into a more, as the minister said, a more normal life. Thanks, Santina. Over the course of the pandemic, there was research done that really looked at the changes that happened, particularly in the early part of the pandemic. So we're showing March to June 2020. And you can see it's based on or compared to a baseline from 2018, where people were asked about these would be people over 50, were asked about, you know, to what extent is there a lack of companionship in your life? And you can see the numbers statistically are significant in change. And we know this by experience. And I can tell you my own lived experience was supporting my mom, who was 91 when the pandemic started, who lived in our basement relatively independently, quite happily. And she had a limited number, but some supports and some companions who spent time with her. As soon as the restrictions were in place, those things were extremely limited. And we saw a deterioration in her health, in her mental health, and in her well-being, despite the fact that she lived right under our roof. Her feelings of isolation intensified, and ultimately she was found herself in need of more support than would be provided under the current arrangement. And so this has happened, and this is the story probably of many seniors who, with the lack of supports that existed, already probably few supports and even less during COVID, less social interaction, less opportunity to get out of the house. Their living situation, their capacity to cope with the ordinary stressors of life has reduced. And many probably have transitioned from independent living to higher levels of care. Those transitions under normal circumstances would require extra support. And we know for sure that under the current circumstances, those changes, as for my mom, when she moved into the care center that she's living in now, she went through all of the normal anxieties and normal challenges of moving, but then there was the isolation, limited ability for us to visit her. And for a while, only my wife and I were the only visitors who were allowed to come in. For good reason, the restrictions made sense. It was seniors were a vulnerable population. I'm not commenting on that. What I'm commenting on is that normal changes that typically stress and are difficult for seniors became even more intensified under COVID. What do we want to do then to re-engage? Well, we need to look at the whole landscape. We need to look at all ages really and understand that mental illness or mental health concerns arise when the ordinary activities of life and the things that we're typically able to cope with become things that we're not coping with very well. Remember that not every mental health challenge results in mental illness. But mental health challenges are again part of the ordinary facts of life. But when life becomes extraordinary under extreme circumstances, catastrophic events, the loss of social supports, etc., it becomes harder and harder to find that balance. We're never perfectly balanced between the challenges of life and the supports that exist. But once again, if we've been isolated, if we've been out of the normal flow of society, we may have forgotten, in fact, what supports we were accessing, or we may be doubtful that those supports continue to exist. And you can see that mental health is achieved by by recognizing, telling the truth that there have been difficult days, there were tough times for Albertans during the pandemic. But the reality is that there are also resources, and our work with the rural communities across Alberta has shown us that many people can often go to that all or nothing thinking that there's nothing in our community. The truth is there is. That's what makes a community community. It's a case of helping people recognize at least those basic points of access that they can have to re-engage in social connection. And those could vary between urban and rural environments. Move forward, Santina. Once, and can we move one more slide? Sorry, I was ahead on my own. This diagram has been used significantly in Alberta. Many probably have seen it through the course of a number of catastrophic events that Alberta has faced over the last number of years. And it is, I think, a very helpful tool. Again, it will be included in the materials that you receive in helping somebody identify where they are in the process of recovery, of the necessary journey, so to speak, to get us back to the place where we begin to look at recovery and reconstruction. Not only, we're not only talking about physical structures, we're talking about mental health and well-being. We use the metaphor of the map in a mall. It might be a while since any of you have been in a mall, but when we want to find a certain store, we go and we look for that marker on the map in the mall that says you are here. And it's important when we look at this particular tool that we keep in mind that this is a journey, that regression is possible. In other words, it can go back and forth. And that there are markers along the road that help us identify where we are. And if you're trying to support somebody or a group of people around the idea of reentry into society post-COVID, this can be a very helpful tool. Take a moment just to look at it and see if you can find yourself where you are in regards to recovery, the recovery period post-COVID.
David, it's Kessa. Apologies for interrupting. There's some feedback just on your end. I just wanted to make sure while people are giving some consideration to this slide, if you could just.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll adjust and see if I can.
Thank you.
Is that better, Kessa?
I think it's just some rustling. It's okay. It's manageable. I'm
okay.
not.
Yeah. I am trying not to rustle. So you've had a chance to look at it, and I hope that you can see it as not the tool, but one tool that might be helpful. And in particular, if you're working with groups of people, this is a great conversation starter to ask people, what is your experience? Where are you on this map, etc. And remember that people are experiencing it, have experienced COVID-19 at various levels of trauma. And so if you're going to have a conversation about this, you also want to be able to ensure that there's support and confidentiality in those conversations. Let's move forward, Santina. So what are social connections and why do they matter? I think that this slide is a beginning of showing some examples of social connection. And I wonder if any of the participants would like to also put into the Q&A chat that you're able to access some ideas about how you see social connection happening between perhaps their clients that you work with, perhaps their seniors in your community that you support, perhaps their family members. And what types of social connections are they accessing, or did they lose and now need to re-engage with? I think we often go direct to, and go ahead and pop in some of your ideas. We often go to the idea that, the senior center, which of course is a valuable resource in any community, is the place to go. And for some coming out of the COVID experience and out of social isolation, the idea of immersing themselves in a center where there could be a lot of people might be a little overwhelming. And so this might be to follow, and we might be a little tired of phased approaches, but phased approaches are proven to be highly effective, particularly with the idea of reintegration into society. And so our homes are opening up as places where people can reconnect. And for some, maybe that's the safest place to begin. And I think there's been many very happy reunions between grandparents and their grandchildren that have happened now as we've had opportunity to open our homes again to our families. I can tell you that was the case for us and our 3 little granddaughters, 6, 4, and 1. But let's remember that for our senior population, while the workplace may not be a place that they're accessing, many of them participated, a very large and committed core of seniors, in volunteer activities. And so for those who are coordinating volunteer involvement, of course, COVID has been a difficult period to continue to engage volunteers. And we need to remember that there will be anxieties and there will be a need to demonstrate that action is being taken to protect people from unnecessary exposure to the germs broadly, but also that we don't overdo it or create a sense of discrepancy between differing environments. I think many of you have had the opportunity to move into environments that we've not been participating in over the last little while, for instance, to go shopping in a retail outlet post the removal of restrictions. And to see the staff wearing masks, it creates a bit of a dissonance, a bit of a space by which we have to think about, if they're wearing masks, should I be wearing a mask, etc. And I think it's even more challenging for many of our senior population to make sense of it all. You know, when I would take my mom after months of being away from her bank or from her doctor's office, it was a different world for her every time we went out. And the challenge was to try to normalize and then talk about this is a temporary situation and that it won't always be like this. So it's about being patient, being thoughtful, and supportive as we move forward. Santea, can you move? There we go. Excellent. Thanks. So interventions is a pretty clinical word, but I think what we're talking about here is broadening our thinking about the way that people could reintegrate into their society. Remembering that sometimes we need to start with very small things in order to get to the place where, as people build their confidence, experience by experience, they begin to venture further out into areas that previously were described as high-risk areas under the restrictions. And once again, remember that for some who have learned new ways of reaching out to each other, i.e. Using technological platforms such as video calling, that's actually a supplement that augments what were the pre-existing points of connection for them. And perhaps there's a level of comfort there that needs to continue to be engaged until the confidence is built. And it's really about building that confidence, reducing the idea of risk when risk no longer exists, and leaning into good information and sharing that information when it is reliable and is supporting people in the direction towards the recovery of the life that was interrupted or disrupted. And remember that recovery is not about getting back everything that you lost. Recovery is being able to reestablish for yourself, whether it's the loss of a home. It's possible to have a home again, but you don't have the same home. Whether it's the loss of access to activities, etc. The activities may have changed. Some of the protocols around those activities may have changed, but it is possible to re-engage in your community. And there are opportunities and resources that exist both virtually and in communities across Alberta that can supplement and build a more fulsome life, a more connected life, which of course we see as reducing the isolation and reducing the impacts of that isolation. And that's the end of the presentation, and happy to endeavor to answer questions. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that presentation, David. Lots of great information and very timely. I think the key message that I've taken from that is that there's this is a personal journey for everyone, and that there's not really a normal way to go about re-engaging into the world, and really that we have to be considerate and thoughtful of not just where we're at in our journeys, but where the people that we're supporting, working, and living with perhaps are in their journeys.
That's right. Irma Bombeck said normal is only a setting on the washing machine. And I think that's a great expression. But you're right that the opportunity now is not to push people into experiences that they're not comfortable with. It's about to model and demonstrate without compulsion. Compulsion does not support better mental health.
So now we'd like to open the forum up for discussion. As a reminder, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function to pose those questions. And so I will just be reading out a couple that we received. So David, what are some resources and strategies that we could use to motivate people? You've shared some of the resources that exist, but if people are reluctant, what are some of the things that we can all do to support them to actually access those resources?
I think that sharing our lived experience is really very important. And so all of us in Alberta have experienced the restrictions and the impacts on greater or lesser degrees of being isolated over the last number of months. And so in the mental health field, we talk a lot about the value of lived experience. And so talking about our own anxieties and our own coping strategies as we've re-entered perhaps the workplace or perhaps back into broader aspects of our communities. Sharing that experience and checking the reaction is really important. I think we talked about this with the panel last time, but a very simple approach is share, check, share. And so that person that you're trying to motivate, of course, compulsion is not going to work. That tends to, for any of us, to want to dig our heels in. And so share a bit about your own experience, how you felt, what you did to overcome those feelings or to access supports, etc. And if the reaction is open, if the individual you're talking to or the group you're talking to continues to inquire, there's more opportunity to share even deeper about specifics that you experience. There's really, one thing that doesn't ring true or authentic is rattling off a list of 10 things you should do. It's really about saying, this worked for me in my own experience, and maybe it'll work for you. Maybe it's worth giving it a try. Motivation is an interesting topic by and large in the seniors community because our focus is on client-centered work and clients making decisions about their own lives. And so we have to be, again, patient.
Thank you. Another question. Do you have any suggestions for handling fear and anxiety in small spaces like elevators and hallways? I think we've all got a certain amount of comfort with larger open venues, but what happens and how do we manage those close quarters?
I think we have a window of opportunity to exercise our right to make a decision about what's good for us. And so despite the fact that restrictions have been removed, you still see a lot of Albertans wearing masks. Many of them have benefited health-wise by wearing masks for lots of other reasons. And there's evidence, there's science that they're the same, that it's highly effective at reducing infection. And so, in our office building, we have an elevator. They've removed the restrictions around how many people can be in that elevator. But again, as our society reintegrates, I think it's still good to check with people before you step on an elevator. I think we've become accustomed to that because some people really don't want to share that space right now. And it will find its way back to, overcrowded elevators. I hope not. And that's just an illustration of the fact that there's directions that we can take that are not about an immediate change and expecting everybody to come along with us in that change just because we're ready. It's about keeping an eye on what's changing and exploring it for ourselves. What am I comfortable with? What makes me cringe? And I'm so glad that there are still restrictions around places and for instance, public transit that were always high exposure areas before to the possibility of infection.
Thanks, David. Another question, how do you see the pathway for reentry being different or similar for people living with dementia or other cognitive impairment as they reintegrate back into their communities?
Right. And so we have in Alberta a number of seniors living with cognitive impairment, dementia, and the full spectrum of those experiences, both in care and in community, and some in a blended form through daycare options, etc. I think there's a body of work around communicating and bringing priority information to people with cognitive impairments and approaches such as CBT, etc., that help integrate that into their capacity to understand and act. But I think society has a role to play as well in ensuring the safety of those who are struggling cognitively to take in all that is happening around them. And again, reactions can be extreme sometimes. And let's face it, it's long enough. It's been long enough to build a habit. Many of the things we're doing now, you feel self-conscious not wearing a mask because it's been 18 months. If it had been 2 weeks, it likely wouldn't have the same impacts. And so the habits probably have been developed as well by folks with cognitive impairments that we must not impose, the expectation that they drop those behaviors simply because the restriction doesn't exist. It's a choice they get to make. It's something they get to think about, and it's something that we can model. And modeling is a huge part of how we get to the desired outcome with folks with impaired cognitive ability. So if you're going out in public with somebody and they're seeing both, for instance, mask and no mask, we have to expect that they're going to struggle with the idea of, much like we have ourselves, right? But to the greater degree. And so those who support them need to model.
Thank you. This is a comment more, but I would ask for if you have any sort of response to it. 10 years ago, I worked for home care in DSL-4 and DSL-3 sites. There were high isolation and loneliness. Even though those sites have full-time staff like LPNs, HCAs, rec therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and groups. The challenge is that many sites are pushed for time. For example, if I stopped to chat with a resident, I had 15 other people I needed to see. One younger member with CP said he would go weeks with only people breezing in to see what he wanted. Then they would rush off to their next client. I think we should be looking at some changes to either training or staff, or increasing the number of staff with mental health understanding of how rampant social isolation and loneliness is for this population. So I don't know, David, if you have any comments to make.
Yeah, I think I'll keep it brief. I think institutional living comes with a broad spectrum of challenges around isolation that is somewhat different than living in the community. And I've had a front row seat of this, watching my mom integrate into a facility that is, in many ways, it reflects the priorities of good healthcare. But people are limited, staff are limited in their ability to integrate and move beyond the duties of the day. And so, enhanced and better trained individuals who can watch for it. I mean, you don't have to be Dr. Phil to figure out if somebody's experiencing isolation or loneliness. You see the traffic that goes in and out. And for a period of time, a long period of time, if visitation was allowed, it was only allowed by 1 or 2 family members and once a week in most facilities. That's not enough contact. And so family members have a role to play in that, because a lot of seniors in long-term care are rarely touched in a way that is not a duty. And so once the opportunity was there that we could re-engage with our family members, to give a hug, to put a supportive hand on the hand of our loved one, they have a role to play. And of course, limitations were there. Those limitations are being rolled back. There are still certainly restrictions for good reason within institutional care. The reality is that much like it takes a village to raise a child, it also takes a village to support a senior and to reduce that isolation.
Thanks, David. Long ago, when you talk about raising a child, long ago, I used to work with children, and we used to talk about physical space and personal space by talking about sort of personal bubbles. And so this question reminds me of that. How do we, can you talk about some ways that we might politely maintain social distancing while interacting with others who don't? So when people are beginning to kind of infringe on our personal bubbles, which have gotten bigger, how do we politely address them?
I'm underqualified for that, but I am a student of what I observe, and I have noticed that certainly as the pandemic was coming into Alberta, that the reactions I saw that were highly charged, that were sort of that push away, that you're in my bubble, were driven by fear and lack of good science and knowledge of what exactly we were dealing with, and we were all on the same wavelength there, right? And some now have probably habituated reaction, right? So they're used to telling people to back off and step away and don't get in my space. Some people have always been like that. Some folks we know that we interact with, they've always had a big bubble, and it wasn't helped. That anxiety wasn't helped by COVID. But again, it comes to basic levels of respect, right? If we respect each other, we'll watch what the reaction is. And sometimes you still have to catch yourself. I do, for sure. I just flew from Edmonton to Winnipeg yesterday, and realizing, that it's our tendency in lineups in airports to push forward because everybody always thinks they're going to miss their flight. But I think our society has learned that it's better to leave a little bit of space. And so you catch yourself and you correct. And again, you're modeling something that it's not hysteria, it's just common sense. And we were asked at the very beginning of the pandemic to apply that nitty gritty common sense that Albertans have always been proud of and been able to apply. And so it's well, politeness is politeness. And if you're being polite or not. So I think that's really important, is we have to check our own reactions too.
Thank you. As we think about reintegration into the world again, as we talked about earlier, there's a range of what is normal or expected. How do you suggest helping people to think through when fear and just general discomfort actually moves into more of a clinical level of anxiety, or when sadness about what we've lost over the last year and a half actually moves into more of a clinical depression? At what point, what are the cues that people can look for to help them figure out when to get help?
Yeah, I think for most of us, and this is not everybody, but for most of us, we have a sense of what normal coping is like. That we can have a bad day. We can have a day where we feel sadder than we typically would feel, or in the experience of grief, that we're deeper in that experience than we have been. And what we are trying to do in observing others that we care for, or in watching our own lives, it's two things. One, we listen to the feedback, right? Is somebody saying to you that you seem to be having trouble getting back to whatever it is, right? Back to the improvements that we saw at some point, or the ability to cope. You're having more trouble finding those strategies that help you cope. So we need to listen to that, because we often don't see it in ourselves. But if we have any doubt that we're losing the ability to come back to that, remember we showed that teeter-totter, to come back to something closer to the level that we've lived at, we need to engage in healthy self-suspicion and stop being so suspicious of everybody else, and ask the question, am I doing as well as I can? Or if you hear yourself saying things to yourself, the self-talk is really important to listen to. I'm better than this, or I usually can just find my way out of it. that indicates probably that there's a time and place to investigate the idea of more support. And that's not a direct link to a psychiatrist or a psychologist's office. It might require that. But more likely, it's about finding the space and an individual to have that conversation about, I'm not quite where I think I should be. I'm not finding my way back to what I thought was normal or the baseline for my life of being able to cope. And that's the opportunity that all Albertans have to say, I don't know a whole lot about this. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor, but I'll go with you. Why don't we look at some options? And there are great resources in Alberta, such as 211, which is accessible both virtually, in chat, as well as on the phone, to inquire anonymously, if you choose, about what are the supports that are very close to me that I might be able to access. If there's nothing in my town, what's within 50 kilometers or 100 kilometers of where I live, or what can I access online? And I would, I'll put out our banner as well in this. The CMHA offices are in many of the larger centers here in Alberta, and they represent regions, much like the health authorities in Alberta. And they have excellent understanding of resources that exist. And as community mental health operators, their work is largely about identifying and helping navigate towards more formal systems and have a knowledge of that, but also providing interventions and supports that are probably less stigmatized, less, there would be less hesitation to engage in. So don't hesitate to go to our websites to access our offices by telephone or in person.
Thanks, David. On that note, are there any specific courses or training or resources that you'd recommend that help to train staff and service providers or volunteers really to not only support the people that they work with, but also to sort of thrive themselves post-pandemic?
Yeah, I think that while we know that employment and workplaces were massively disrupted over the COVID period, one place we need to really think about is how we support better mental health in workplaces and working environments. And I know that many of our seniors are retired, et cetera, but many of them live in workplaces. They live in spaces where work is being done. So one of the things I would recommend is taking a look at our workplace mental health network. It's accessible through cmhalberta.ca. Another is that in rural and remote communities, there are different considerations that we might want to look at in regards to training, in regards to resources. And our work is largely about building networks, and there is accessible to all Albertans an opportunity to join for no cost and access resources that exist on the Rural Mental Health Network, also accessible through our website. And finally, a lot of our post-secondary students and parents who are sending those students to school in the fall, they had a very different experience through COVID. And so we really encourage people also to look at and access webinars and support that is happening through Healthy Campus Alberta, which is our community practice for better mental health in post-secondary environments. I have more, but that'll be enough. And I think there's a resource sheet that's being sent out as well.
Thank you. I think you've touched on elements of this, but there's been a question. How do I know when I'm overdoing it? So with the enthusiasm of kind of re-entering society, we've lived a certain way for a long time. What are some of the things that we should all be watching for and attending to so that we're aware of when we're overdoing it and not being mindful of our own mental health?
Yeah, one of the things that happened, I think, for Albertans during the COVID period was we were, maybe not directly, but we found ourselves observing the behavior of others as it pertains to our own experience. And so, we've seen that over enthusiastic embracing of no restrictions in our own neighborhoods, And I wonder if my wife maybe was the one who asked this question, because across the alley, there's a house that just has seemed to have had a perpetual party since July 1, with a lot of traffic. And it's amazing how that would, I mean, it might have caused a ripple in our neighborhood, but how that's become a focal point of people saying like too much, too soon, etc. So again, we need to remember that our society has been under a form of restrictions that were not voluntary by and large, and habituation, the idea that this is now part of our life, over 2 years, almost 2 years of time, it's going to be there. So our thinking is going to be, that's bad. And black and white thinking is a real challenge for any of us. And that's bad and I'm good because I'm sitting in my house alone. But remember that being alone is not good for us. It's not good for our mental health. It's not good for our physical health. We need to be alone sometimes, but we need to be engaged with others around us. And so removing that black and white thinking is a challenge, and living in that gray area is sometimes a challenge. But we need to acknowledge there are gray areas in our society that we had a comfort with before. Can we get there? And so how do you know whether you're overdoing it? I think if you're asking that question, healthy self-suspicion, right? Don't be hard on yourself, but it's okay to, in a healthy way, say, have I overdone it? And I mean, grandparents, I'm a grandparent. I want to grab those kids every time I see them. I've got these 3 beautiful little granddaughters, and every time, and I think these kids have not been hugged, brought into our home for months and months and months. So it's logical to think they might be overwhelmed by an over-enthusiastic grandfather. And I typically am. So same thing. If I'm asking the question, if I'm making that observation, then probably I am overdoing it, and I was. hard not to engage in that reunion, right, and live it to the full. Yeah.
Thanks, David, very much. That is all of the questions that we have received so far. So I think that we will wrap up a little bit early today. We're very grateful to Minister Pon for hosting this important series, and thank you so much to David for an excellent webinar today and a really lively discussion. And thanks to everybody who submitted questions as well. There are 2 more webinars coming up to discuss the following topics. So strategies to manage grief and loss, and resources to support managing burnout and stress. And I think that those will both be very timely as well as we continue through our re-entry into the world. Dates and registration information can be found on our webpage, the link to which was posted earlier on in the chat box. We encourage you to register early for these sessions. As I mentioned, this webinar will be posted on our website shortly. If you missed the first webinar that was held on June 30th that focused on mental health and supports for seniors, please visit the same link that's been posted in the chat, where you will find the recorded webinar, presentations, and the mental health resource listing that we've referenced today. This webinar will also be posted on CORE Alberta. The CORE Alberta website is just corealberta.ca, which has more links to additional resources mentioned by David today and panelists previously during their presentations. Upon exiting this webinar, there will be a short voluntary survey that you may choose to complete. The results of the survey will help us to inform the development of future webinars. So thank you all very much again for joining us today. I hope you learned something new. I know that I did, and look forward to seeing you next time.